Hello everyone, my name is Emanuel Garcia, and in today's presentation we'll be talking about narrative design in the video game and tabletop game industries. This presentation is designed for beginners and inspiring game designers. However, we'll be hearing exclusive interviews from talented designers, writers, and academics of the industry for experienced viewers as well. Not only will we be talking about narrative design, but other roles and the video game industry in other countries and in Puerto Rico. Initially, before working on this project, I wanted to learn more about narrative design from experienced designers of the industry. As I kept interviewing more and more people, I thought, maybe I should just share this knowledge with everyone else. And so I wanted to inspire not just video game designers, but tabletop game designers as well. And so here we are. I wanted to give thanks to Colin McComb, Mateusz Tomaszkiewicz, Nick Jones, Shirley McPhaul, Simon Goudreault, and Matthew A. Goodwin for being part of this project. We'll learn more about their backgrounds and experiences as we go on in the presentation. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm Emanuel Garcia, also known as Mr. Stids in social media, DriveThruRPG, and Patreon. In those platforms, I design tabletop RPG content for Balactonia Publishing and freelance for other companies like Igamish Games, and of course, to the patrons on my Patreon page. My main background is in mechanical engineering. I worked in the medical device and aerospace industries for over 5 years as a manufacturing engineer. My expertise is in project management, production, and technical writing. In January of 2021, I started my own business called Polus PR and provided freelance writing and narrative design services to independent designers and publishers. Along the way, I was fortunate to be part of the Cyberpunk Day team, where we share cyberpunk content from talented creators around the world. And of course, lastly, I've been game mastering D&D games since 2013. So I've been creating stories, characters, and worlds using Pathfinder 1st Edition, D&D 5th Edition, Cyberpunk Red, and much more. There are 3 main goals that we want to achieve by the end of this presentation. Number 1, educate and inspire aspiring narrative designers in both the video game and tabletop game industries. Number 2, inspire developers, designers, and creators to expand and grow the industry in Puerto Rico. Lastly, number 3, learn how to get started with narrative design. To achieve these goals, here are some of the topics that we'll cover throughout this presentation. We'll attempt to define narrative design with the help of other professionals in the industry. We'll compare design differences between tabletop games and video games. We'll also ask our guests if tabletop RPGs are a good start for narrative design. We then transition our focus to indie development and the video game industry. We'll discuss how we can expand the gaming industry in Puerto Rico and if crowdsourcing is a good start. Let's start with a basic understanding and definitions of narrative design. What is narrative design? According to a Ubisoft news article from Vincent Manilev titled, "What is narrative design?" This is what Sarah said. Ask 10 narrative designers to describe their job, and you will get 10 different answers. Without going into the more technical aspects, I think the narrative designer is a sort of hybrid cross-disciplinary role that spans across game mechanics and narrative. Although we won't ask 10 narrative designers, we will ask some of our guests and their opinions about the definition of narrative design. If we were to visualize the aspects of narrative design, we can imagine it like an X and Y graph, where X is ideas over time and Y is sensory experience. The line intercepting both the X and Y is known as interactivity. The player generates ideas over time through interaction with the in-game world. We'll provide a few examples, but for now, let's introduce you to some of our video game narrative designers. We'll be hearing from Colin McComb, known for Planescape Torment and Wasteland, Mateusz Tomaszkiewicz, known for The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt and Cyberpunk 2077, and Nick Jones, known for Path of Exile and Heroic Magic Duel. I apologize in advance for the audio quality of some of the interviews. Let's listen to their versions of what is narrative design.
My name is Mateusz Tomaszkiewicz. I used to work at CD Projekt for around 12 years in different roles, but mostly on narrative design. My latest role was a quest director for Cyberpunk 2077. Currently, I'm waiting for my visa process to be finalized. I'm moving to Riot Games. And in the meantime, I'm doing freelance jobs. So like narrative design consulting, freelance design, stuff like that. Most broadly speaking, narrative design in my mind is the art of telling stories to the players and figuring out how to tell these stories in the medium that you're working in, which for me most of the time was obviously video games. But currently I also dabbled a little in board games as well. So it's basically thinking very carefully about the medium you have to design stories for. Doing that, it can involve, but I don't think it has to involve writing actual dialogues, which I did from time to time. Yeah, I think it is this in a nutshell.
Colin McComb has been a game designer since right after he graduated from college with a philosophy degree in 1991. He worked first at TSR, the original publishers of Dungeons & Dragons, building adventures and designing campaign worlds like Birthright and Planescape for the 2nd edition rule set, along with a few setting-agnostic accessories. After about 5 years there, he took a job with the RPG division of Interplay Productions that would later be called Black Isle Studios. There he worked on Fallout 2 and Planescape Torment. He went back to tabletop design for a bit, working with Paizo's Pathfinder rules and helped develop their setting of the world of Galarian. After that, he went back to computer games with Exile, where he worked on Wasteland 2, Wasteland 3, and acted creatively for Torment, Tides of Numenera. He did some consulting with Larian on Baldur's Gate 3 and is currently working with Drop Bear Bytes, acting creatively for the upcoming Australian post-apocalyptic isometric RPG called Broken Roads. He's also one of the owners of 3 Pound Games Inc., a VR XR developer, and they've recently released a game called Vault of Stars into early access for Oculus Quest. This is what Colin said. For me, it's about telling a story in partnership with systems design and art. It ties the gameplay to the story and vice versa, creating a narrative throughout the game and focuses on the player's experience from moment to moment and scene to scene. And because each player can experience the game in a different way, it's a narrative designer's job to account for those perspectives and ensure that the experience remains coherent from start to finish.
My name's Nick. I am a narrative designer, and I also dabble in transmedia production. But primarily, my work for the past 6 years has been focused on working with indie developers in the video game space and helping them sort of develop, first and foremost, a sort of story bible for their projects. So sort of all the expansive world building. And then after that, things like developing a narrative strategy for them going forward if they're wanting to sort of take over the control of the story themselves, or alternatively, I will sort of come on board and do all the dialogue writing for them and all the sort of in-game text, all that sort of stuff as well. So yeah, I mean, outside of that, I am also an academic working in the same space, but looking at sort of narrative design from a narratological standpoint. I pioneered the first tertiary level paper on narrative design here in New Zealand at the Auckland University of Technology, which we had running for a couple of years until the pandemic struck and unfortunately took out quite a few of our papers. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's a good overview for you. Yeah, I sort of dabble in those two fields. Personally, I define narrative design as I guess in the most sort of simplistic terms, it's about constructing worlds and constructing those worlds with the understanding that an audience member or a player can navigate those worlds in a non-linear fashion in whatever way they choose. And so because of that, we have to sort of consider how is the story conveyed to the player or to the audience through this world in a way that makes sense, regardless of how they sort of approach or tackle the world itself. If we were to sort of jump a little bit deeper into a definition, I would say that narrative design focuses primarily on sort of marrying the gameplay mechanics in a game with the narrative, right? So you want to create what's called ludonarrative cohesion, which is where the gameplay reflects the themes of the narrative and the narrative reflects the gameplay. A good way to sort of illustrate that, I guess, is you can look at games that don't do this well. There's a game that sort of always comes to mind when I'm asked this question, which is one of the new Wolfenstein games. I'm not sure if you've played them or not, but these games are narratively they're very sort of somber. You've got this sort of somber protagonist that's doing this voiceover throughout the game, where he's sort of talking about the evils of war and how it's affected his psyche as you play through the game. But at the same time, the gameplay is encouraging you to kill a bunch of Nazis in the most dramatic and violent ways possible, right? And it rewards you for that. Now, I'm all for taking down Nazis, but what you've got there is a narrative theme that is in contrast or opposition to the gameplay, right? And so that's ludonarrative dissonance. It sort of pulls the player out of the experience, out of being fully immersed. So the aim of narrative design really is to do the opposite of that, which is to sort of make sure those two things are working together so that players or audience members can become more and more immersed to the point where they're essentially stepping into another world.
To clarify, Wolfenstein is a great game. It provides a different experience in terms of gameplay and narrative. On that note, narrative design is not just about writing and creating dialogue for certain characters. It's much more than just telling a story. It's creating a believable world within the themes and mechanics of the game. Here's what Colin said regarding what skills are necessary. Creativity, cooperation, that is being able to work with a wide range of people, analytical ability to see what needs work and where systems can mesh well with gameplay, and the desire to iterate and improve. Good writing and communication skills are essential. Depending on the project, you may end up using certain tools like Twine for branching narratives or Celtx for in-game cinematics or level design. However, these tools are not necessary to be a good narrative designer. There are other skills that are far more important to develop first. Let's look at a few more from Nick and Mateusz.
Yeah, so I mean, first off, I would sort of echo the famous sort of writer's idea that if you want to write, you need to read a lot. Though I would sort of slightly and say if you want to write for games, you need to play a lot of games. So a large part of my life is playing games and sort of actively thinking as I'm playing through them. What sort of experience am I having here? What do I like? What don't I like? What do I think the narrative is trying to do in this game? So that would be the first sort of skill that I would suggest is needed. Like I said, also having a strong sort of background in storytelling theory, the craft of storytelling is really important as well. So this is all stuff you can pick up in a book or online fairly easily. You don't necessarily need to go and like study at a university or anything. Though that can also be helpful simply because universities sort of give you that structure to like help you push past things like procrastination to explore the theory side of things at a deeper level. Outside of those, yeah, I mean it's there is a degree of sort of intuition, I guess, as well. You need to sort of be able to navigate large worlds and understand everything that is happening within that world. Particularly if you are working on more than one project at a time. I know I've definitely had experiences where I've caught myself, muddling two projects together because the worlds for both are so big that you sort of start to think of them as one large thing. So it's definitely very important to be able to differentiate between the two and hold all that information in your head. I guess, another important skill to have would be things like communication or sort of a willingness to come alongside different people in the development pipeline that may not be your natural discipline and sort of help them understand the story and work with them to make sure that the work that they are doing reflects the artwork in a game, right? You want the artwork to reflect the feel and tone of the world as well as the lore that you've developed for that world. So it would be important to sit down with artists and explain, okay, so this part of the world looks like this, it's inspired by this, or maybe you're dealing with different factions in a game, so you would sort of need to sit down with them and be like, okay, so this faction, this is the history of their ancestry or whatever, and these are the symbols that they use in their family crest, or things like that, so that the artist can then take that information and produce artwork that reflects that.
So for me, it's usually it's writing, and it's usually in the form of documents. Like I do use sticky notes as reminders for myself regarding specific tasks. Like I will make task lists in sticky notes, but then it's usually about making documents. And yeah, again, depending on what specific task I'm doing, if it's a design task, I usually try to work on a very high level idea first, and then I delve into the details as I approve this high level idea with the stakeholders for whatever project I'm working on. So for example, if I'm working on side quests, I will first try to generate a large amount of very short, brief, simple ideas for side quests that, once you read 1-2 sentences, once you read this, you should know exactly what is supposed to be like the meat of that quest, right? Like what is supposed to be appealing about it? What is the idea? Then I will filter this with the stakeholders to make sure that we are picking the quests that they actually need for their project. And of course, as I also design those, I also try to keep in mind what kind of stories does their IP need to be told in this world, right? Because, for example, in The Witcher 3, we knew that we wanted to say things about Nilfgaardian invasion. We wanted to say things about specific characters and specific themes from that world. So as we were sitting down to generating these ideas with the team, first we wrote down what kind of themes that we need to explore, right? So you were free to come up with all kinds of different wacky ideas for side quests, but we were suggesting that you can use these themes as starting point, right? If we need, for example, to explain anti-elf sentiments, like anti-elf racism within the human communities, right? This would be a good starting point for a number of quest designers to think of a story that could be telling you about this theme. And yeah, I still work in this way. I'm very used to working this way, and I still do it now. When it comes to writing like longer stories, so like more of a chain quest or like a main storyline or something like that. Of course, it's very important when sitting down to think about what are the main themes of that story that you want to tell to the players. You need to think about like main selling points of that IP. And finally, you need to have like a proper pacing and the length of it, right? It's an obvious thing, but like the length of this campaign like will impact your budget for the game. So you need to make sure with the client that or the stakeholder that this is done properly. So you don't design something that to be actually made into a game because it's too costly, for example. What else I can say about it? These are the main things I would say at this design production after a game, so it can be actually played through. And the next steps would involve like getting the dialogues for the quests, like checking these dialogues. Wasn't anything lost when they were written? Like, is it still very logical? Is the pacing still right? And of course, like implementing different kinds of assets and scripting like sequences in game, so they work properly. All up to do like the release of the game and bug fixing.
What does your day-to-day look like? This is what Colin said. It depends on where I am in the process. If it's pre-production, it's a lot of meetings, research, and documentation. Primarily creative idea generating work. If it's in production, then I'm working on in our tools, Unity, dialogue systems, and the like. And having sync up meetings, stand-ups, and team sharing. The cerebral creative work is largely done, and the productive creative work has started. There are different phases for a narrative designer's work. Of course, there are different processes for each studio and individual. However, the first phase for every new project is generating ideas and organizing them for your team. To fluidly transfer your ideas to other team members, organization and communication are key.
Yeah, no, look, you again, like I said before, you can be the most brilliant writer, but like that's only part of the game, really. You have to be able to communicate and empathize and interact with other people. I've taught a lot of people over the years the sort of basics of narrative design, and you can always sort of tell who's going to go far in the industry based on primarily their ability to interact with others and sort of be bold and confident, particularly when it comes to pitching ideas and explaining the reasoning for those ideas. If you are too shy or just unwilling to engage in conversation and debate with other developers, then it's going to be very hard for you to progress in the industry. I always think of narrative design being sort of like equal parts creator and equal parts producer, and the typical producer person is someone that is a salesman, I guess. Someone that can sell anything at any given moment. And I'm not saying you have to be great at it, but you definitely have to have that sort of component to how you present yourself professionally, so that you can defend your viewpoints and convince others of why a certain story decision is the right idea.
How does narrative design translate to other mediums? Let's introduce Simon, also known as Wander DM, where he's known for live tabletop RPG sessions on Twitch and writing for Crowdsourcing Games and Mage Hand Press. We'll also listen to Mateusz and his experience with board game design.
My actual name is Simon Goudreault. I am a narrative designer. I work full-time for a gaming company called Flyos. And we'll probably get into like what I do later in greater details. But aside from that, I also freelance for various TTRPG companies, one of which is Crowdsourcing Games. The books that I've worked on will be released. I think one of them is fairly soon. I'm not privy to all the dates, but I work through them, through Mage Hand Press. I did some self-publishing as well, and those are available like on Drive-Thru RPG, the DM's Guild, and all those places. So I have like 3 jobs, if you will, because in addition to all that, there's also streaming with all of the actual plays that we have on the channel, or the ones that I play in on other people's channels. Ironically, the game that I'm working on at the moment is very much written like a video game, with cinematics, with player input and dialogue. In fact, if you've played like Mass Effect or Dragon Age, it's pretty much the game I'm working on, except that there are no AI or computers running everything. You do everything manually through like tokens and whatnot, and that's a challenge that we have, right? That we need to be able to replicate these things using whatever components we have at our disposal. Which, if you compare it to an RPG, if you're playing a TTRPG, you can do pretty much whatever you want, because worst comes to worst, you'll do theater of the mind. You don't need minis, you don't need maps, you don't need buildings. With the board game, the thing is everything needs to be self-contained, so we can't really tell someone, well, you should, get a sheet of paper and start noting things down on the side, because you'll need that later. It needs to already be provided, so that you don't need to print like new material. You don't need to go get like a second PDF for like that specific class you wanted, or in our case, vampire that came out. Everything is provided, and we need to stick to this. So it's also telling a story, but using only the components that we have. Whereas I'm working on other games, of course, as well, and some of them are completely different, because the story is very minimal. And it's going to be told through, for example, let's take Magic the Gathering, flavor text on the cards. So there is a story going on, but you'll only notice it if you take all the cards one by one and you read them out and you place them together. You'll be able to sort of piece together what the story was. And that, of course, is another type of writing that's completely different than like game notes. Knowing how to write dialogue is also very important.
It's also kind of liberating in a way, because it's more bespoke, if that makes sense. Like in a video game, especially in AAA video games, like let's say The Witcher or Cyberpunk, if you want to have a scene where a dragon eats someone, let's say, you have to show it on the screen, right? And that can get very costly very quickly. Like the cost of animating a dragon eating someone, right, can be very, very costly. It's just a random example. We never actually had that. But yeah, in a board game, you can do bespoke things where you can have, for example, like a text event tell you about someone being eaten by a dragon, right? You don't really need to show much. You can have some illustration, and that's really it, right? You don't have to put all this effort and cost to have an actual scene of dragon eating someone. And it's just obviously like one of the examples. You can do a lot of different like creative things that would be difficult to show in a video game otherwise. So I think this is another interesting aspect of it. And yeah, it's just also like the fact that you meet people that think in completely different ways, because like the designers that are used to working on board games, like they have a different way of thinking about mechanics and like balancing things, and then compared to like let's say video game gameplay designers, right? Again, because they are faced with different challenges and different limitations, of the medium. So yeah, that's also very, very refreshing to me. I really enjoy learning all that stuff. I don't have much of experience with board games as a designer. Like, I'm currently helping with one board game, and this is the first board game I ever worked on. I played a lot of board games. Like, I have 2 or 3 board game groups here in Warsaw, and we would play on regular basis. Variety of games, like from games that are like purely mechanical, like Euro games, which are all about like gathering points and like winning against other players, to games where you have to use deception and like you can be like the traitor, for example. Really do enjoy those. To the like very narrative games, which like, let's say, Mansions of Madness, where you have actual stories that you go through, right? Like directed narratives, like with actual writing, dialogues, and all that you play through, and you reach a specific goal or goals. So I played a variety of them. So
I can tell you for my freelance projects more than my day job, though they are similar. It's just for the day job, we have like specific software for that, branching software. I mean, the worst that I've seen someone use, and they're a very well-known game designer, Josh Sawyer, who once showed on his blog dialogues for, I believe it was the game Planescape, the original, and it was an Excel spreadsheet, if memory serves. I don't know how they did that. So we have like an app developed in-house for that. So it's easier because of that. But for the freelancing and more or less for the narrative design at the day job, it's I always start with an outline, a bullet point list. I'm a big fan of the Lazy DM's Guide by Sly Flourish. So it's normally it's a book that helps you prep for D&D games in 5 minutes or less, and it works. It's amazing how much of a time saver it is. I shouldn't say 5 minutes. Let's say half an hour. And I follow more or less the outline that they give. So it's mostly the first draft will be, what am I talking about? What do I want the player to get out of this? Then what are the elements of play that the player will encounter? By elements of play, I mean like can be items that they find, traps. In the case of Cyberpunk, I would also say like what's the net running architecture if there's one available, and just have just the big lines, like just an overview, nothing too deep, too detailed. And then I'll sometimes have a step-by-step of how the regular flow should proceed. That's the first draft. It's basic. When I work for something that's more on the game design aspect than the narrative, you can remove the step-by-step guide of what the players should do and where they should go with, here's how I think this monster should act. Here's the gimmick behind the monster. That gets, so in my day job, there's like 500 approvals that needs to be done, that need to be met before I can proceed to 500 hyperbole, but before I can proceed to the next step. So it's harder when it's freelancing. It's normally just one person. You send your stuff to them. They'll say yes, no, here's what you need to change. Here's what you might need to expand upon, blah, blah, blah. They send it back. And then the second draft will be short sentences. And I'm keeping it to only what's like mandatory. So it's preferable, especially if you freelance when you're paid by the word count. You normally do not want to cut through. But believe me, it's better to have something that's a little shorter And by that I mean that you meet the word count or that you're very close to it without overextending by hundreds, thousands of words. So it's better if it's more concise. So that's my work process. It's basically 3 versions. The very early draft, like the skeleton, if you will. I call it the skeleton, then the first draft, then the sort of final version, because it always needs to be approved. So even your final version with all that fancy text will be changed in one way or another. Ooh, and that's one thing. As a narrative designer, you need to be able to take criticism, but you also need to be able to let go of what you've written. It's not because you wrote something that you're super proud of that it will remain in that form until the very end. And so often you might, write 20 pages on something, but only 10 of those pages can make it into the game. So the project lead will go through them and will cut what feels unnecessary. You have to accept that fact because it'll happen often, and is a very good quality to have as a designer in general, not just narrative.
I asked some of our designers if tabletop RPGs are beneficial for a narrative designer. This is the consensus. Here's what Colin said regarding to this question. 100% yes. I'd even say it's essential if you're working on a CRPG. It teaches you to think about a problem from multiple perspectives, to consider ways to get around particular situations, and how and when to erect reasonable barriers for players to stay somewhat on track with the work you're trying to do. Tabletop RPGs are a great start in being introduced to narrative design. Let's look at a few key points on how to get started with it. Gaining experience from playing games and being able to narratively critique each one is the first step in getting into narrative design. Play different genres of games in both video games and tabletop games. Do research, find other people's story bibles, and ask yourselves, how can I make this better, narratively and organizationally? This will broaden your perspective and see what works and what doesn't work. Once you have a good understanding of storytelling in either video games or tabletop games, start creating your own adventures using tabletop RPGs or game mod editors. After creating a handful of adventures, start creating your story bible. The story bible is a document that contains everything about the world that you're creating. This includes magic systems, history, characters, stories, items, and so on. It's important to keep this document organized and easy to read for other potential team members. And finally, learn new techniques and tools that will benefit you as a narrative designer. Once I started creating adventures and quests for my players in Pathfinder and D&D, I learned how to pace my game sessions, how to create engaging characters, and how to implement game mechanics into the story. After years of honing this craft, I am fortunate enough to publish original adventures and settings to others online using DriveThruRPG and Patreon. Narrative design is similar to writing a novel, but what's the difference? Let's introduce to Matthew A. Goodwin, where he's known for Into Neon, a cyberpunk saga, which is a novel series containing 7 books. We'll then transition and talk about the video game industry as a whole and in Puerto Rico. Shirley McPhaul is an academic and representative of Puerto Rico's Game Developers Association. Let's start with Matthew and his take on the differences between writing a novel and a video game.
I am Matthew A. Goodwin. I am a science fiction and unpublished fantasy author. I currently have 8, I want to say, cyberpunk books out, 5 in my cyberpunk saga series, which is planning to be a 7-book series. and which I expect to wrap up early 2022. So maybe by the time people are listening to this, all 7 books will be out. Well, of course, I mean, and this is the second video game I'll be writing on. I wrote some characters for Silicon Dreams, which is a cyberpunk video game. Anybody out there, it's out right now. It's basically doing the Voight-Kampff test from Blade Runner. It's really awesome. I was lucky to be involved in that. Of course, the main difference between writing a book and writing on a video game is going to be working with other people. In both of these scenarios, I'm writing in somebody else's world. Even if it is ancient Rome or cyberpunk, it is the lead designer's vision of those scenarios. So you have to adapt to those confines. You also are writing for a gamer. You're writing for somebody who's going to be making choices. It's much more akin to DMing or GMing than it is to writing. When I'm writing my book, I'm taking the reader on the journey I want to take them on. When you're writing a game, you want the player to be able to feel that they are shaping the world a bit, that they are making choices that actually make a difference. And so that's a huge difference in how to train your brain. Also, for writing the Silicon Dreams, you're on the rails a bit. I mean, you can think of even games that are like Mass Effect or The Witcher that have these very complicated dialogue options. They are still ultimately, 6 dialogue options that have branching choices. And that is a very, very different experience than writing a book. You're also letting either actors or voice actors or just the dialogue itself speak for itself in a way that you don't when you're writing a book. Obviously, you can have dialogue tags in a book. He said rambunctiously, and then he did a little dance. And those are things that may or may not exist in the version of a video game that you're writing. So you also have to learn to speak more with dialogue than with your dialogue tags. It's a very nuanced thing, but it definitely has taught me how to write a little bit differently and in a way that is pretty cool. And I hope it makes my dialogue stronger in my books. And I think, any writing experience is only going to make you stronger in your other writing as well.
Indie developers have far more limitations than AAA studios. However, this doesn't mean that you can't create an excellent game. Once you identify your capabilities and resources, ask yourselves, what kind of game can I create that's immersive and engaging to the player? If your goal is to create a survival game with the option to gather resources and mine minerals to create shelter from savage monsters, how would you develop this game? You don't need a story to develop a game as long as your world coincides with the themes and mechanics. Minecraft is a great example. The mechanics and world complement the themes of the game. As you explore and gather resources, the player is rewarded with entries to new dimensions, new materials, and new game mechanics. Contrary to a game with a narrative and character dialogue like Firewatch, the player is rewarded with new details of the story and character background. Firewatch also does an excellent job of marrying game mechanics to the themes of the game. The video game industry is evolving rapidly over the years, with more and more talented and experienced developers interested in creating their own games. AAA studios are being established to create more original games for the public. The industry is more competitive than ever before. New technologies are being created while new roles are being produced. The gaming market is expected to reach a value of $315 billion by 2027. In their current state, North America and Europe have the highest market growth rate in the world, while South America and the Caribbean have the lowest market growth rate. Let's understand why the industry in Puerto Rico is not growing as fast as in other countries like in Colombia or Argentina. Let's introduce Shirley, who she's known for creating content for PRGDA and providing courses to students in Puerto Rico.
So my name is Shirley McPhaul, and I'm currently part of the PRGDA, Puerto Rico Game Developers Association. I'm actually co-founder and part of the board of directors of the association. Aside from that, I actually studied comparative literature. So I have a degree in comparative literature. My master's degree, I have a master's degree in Viking and medieval Norse studies. And then I have a second master's degree in comparative literature. As part of my master thesis for my degree in comparative literature, I actually wrote about character design in Metroid, specifically Samus power suit, and comparison with shield maidens in Viking legend, and how the character design of Samus's armor and her story and the narrative around her really build her up as a very masculine character, and something that also happens in medieval literature, well, at least in Scandinavian legend. Puerto Rico is a very particular case, right? So Puerto Rico is a very particular case because, well, in part because of our political circumstances. So unlike other territories or other places in Latin America, where right now the industry is growing very, very fast, like Colombia, Argentina, Uruguay, although these are places, particularly Uruguay and Argentina, are places where the industry has been established for 10 years. Places like Colombia and Mexico, it's been maybe like 5 years, but we are far behind, like even those countries. And I think that that's because our talent leaves the island, right? So we have all these universities with all these programs that are training game designers, artists, programmers. We have all the talent that we need, and in Puerto Rico, like some of the best engineers in the United States come from Puerto Rico, from El Recinto Universitario Mayagüez. But they end up leaving, right? They don't stay here because either there are no opportunities for them or they don't get paid enough. And I completely understand. Like I don't want it to sound like I am blaming them for leaving. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge the fact that if leaving wasn't an option, then our video game industry, and probably many others, would be a lot different, because it is a lot easier, right? And again, I'm not judging. I don't want it to sound like I'm judging people who leave. I'm really not. But I do think that it's easier for people to leave. It is the option that they have, and they take it, and that's fair enough. But the consequence of that is that for those of us who decide to stay and to work from Puerto Rico and to find ways of making it work, it's a lot more difficult because we don't have enough talent here. Right now, I've had a few members of the community who've left to Canada because over there, the industry is a lot larger. The salaries are super competitive, right? And there is no way that a small studio in Puerto Rico can compete with the salaries that they are offering right now in Canada. I think that what we need to do on the island in order to help the industry grow is allow the people that we have here to gain experience remotely. And by that, what I mean is finding or creating collaborations or finding opportunities where we can have our students from the different universities, maybe people who just graduated and are looking for jobs, for opportunities to learn from top industry studios, right? Remotely, so that I can stay here and they don't have to go anywhere. I think that would be very valuable for us, because another hurdle that we have is, of course, that because there is no work here, there are no internship opportunities. So we have a lot of students that graduate with their college degree, but have never worked on a project other than their capstone project. Many have never worked on a team project for 6 months to a year, right? They have never pushed it, or they've never published a game either. And even though I also think that the institutions here should make sure that their students graduate with a game published, even if it's the App Store or Google Play Store, they should graduate with a published game, in my opinion. We need to find a way to give these developers and these artists opportunities in Puerto Rico for them to be able to hone their skills and for them to be able to, practice and just know what the industry is like. Otherwise, you're just going to keep leaving. And like I said before, I can't blame them. I don't judge them, but it's the reality that the industry is facing. If we want to have a video game industry in Puerto Rico, we need to do something to retain our talent.
Echoing to what Shirley said, many of the best engineers and designers are from Puerto Rico. Some of our best talent contributed to many of the most successful and popular games of all time. Puerto Rico has the talent, creative drive, and skill to make great games. Developers and designers need the appropriate tools and programs to grow and evolve the video game industry in Puerto Rico. To be part of the industry and gain experience as a game designer, developer, or coordinator, you need to do research and find the best path for you, whether it's narrative design or production. Here are more talented designers, engineers, and developers of the industry from Puerto Rico. What other options do we have to engage with other communities around the world? Let's talk about crowdsourcing and their pros and cons.
Right now, the financial options or the options that game studios or game makers have in Puerto Rico to finance their games are they're few, of course. Like we are fully aware that for an investor, putting money down to create a game is a big risk, because you have to put a lot of money up front and you don't really get back your investment until after the game has been published. And that could be anywhere from, depending of the game, of course, and how big your team is, that could be anywhere from 6 months to 18 months or even more. That being said, I do think that crowdsourcing is a good choice for games, but I would also be wary about it in the sense that I think that you need to build a community that is willing to support your game before considering kickstarting it. And that is a problem, at least for our community here in Puerto Rico. For whatever reason, I can't really tell you why. It might be a cultural thing. It might be, I don't know, a weird characteristic of the community. People here are very secretive about what they're doing. And it's like they don't want to tell anyone about their game, and they're afraid of others stealing their ideas. And that is a huge obstacle, because it would be perfect if you were making a game and you have your game up in GitHub, and then if you get stuck, you can go to the Discord and be like, yo, I'm stuck on this part. Can anyone help me out? And then someone from the community, maybe someone with a lot more experience than you, can come jump in and be like, oh yeah, I can definitely help you out. And then the obstacle is fixed. And then like, oh, I'm gonna need like someone to help me with the environment. Anyone here can help me? And maybe, and that way, by leaning on the community, you would actually be able to create a solid prototype, or something that you can then take and build a Kickstarter campaign around with the help of the community, with the help of others. But because there is this, I don't even know why it happens, but because the people are so secretive and so, I don't know if this is the right word, but like jealous, right, of their ideas, I really think it works against them every single time, because then nothing gets done. You are one person. Your prototype is not going to be nearly as good as it would be if you had more people helping you. And I really think that is the biggest problem. And I really do think that is the reason why we don't see more projects from Puerto Rico in places like Kickstarter or this type of platforms.
Let's learn more about our guests and how they got into the video game and tabletop game industries as narrative designers or academics. This is what Colin said. It started with game mastering tabletop games, honestly. I had to account for how my players might foil or break my carefully planned campaigns and be familiar with the system's rules and my settings so I could improvise when the players inevitably took off an entirely wrong trail. From there, I started designing tabletop games and naturally evolved from that into computer games.
Sure. So actually, I got into game development right after high school. I wasn't entirely sure what I would like to do with my life. And this actually, seemed like a nice perspective. And I didn't start off as a narrative designer per se. I took my first steps in QA, so quality assurance. So I worked there for I think a year or two. It was mostly playtesting the game, looking for bugs, reporting that, testing the tools for the designers. But during that time, I had a really nice overview of how games are made and what do other departments do. I had the opportunity to meet a lot of people and learn a lot. And immediately, of course, I was attracted to design. Back in the day, in CD Projekt, when I was in QA, there were no further divisions in the design. So you had gameplay designers there, you had writers, you had narrative designers, quest designers, and so on and so forth. It got more specialized later on as we were working on Witcher 2, Assassins of Kings. And at that time, I already joined design team. And the team that I was assigned to was the quest design, which, in my opinion, is pretty much narrative design minus writing dialogues. Because what quest designers are doing in CD Projekt, they were given responsibility to write down the story on very detailed level. So you are assigned chunks of the story, and you have to figure out what events will happen exactly, what introductions for the characters will be given, how to dose informations to the players so they understand what is happening and what they have to do, what kind of gameplay sequences you have in there, because gameplay, as you know, is a big part of storytelling in video games. It can be. So we also very actively try to do that to make sure that the gameplay fits right to the story and actually helps telling the story and doesn't go contrary to what you actually want to tell.
I actually kind of fell into it almost by accident. I like to sort of give you a very sped up version of the story. In a previous life, I went to a Bible college to appease my religious parents, and sort of was doing that for a while, and then realized somewhere along that point that I was gay, and that it was the way that I was living was not really for myself, sort of living for all these other people. So I ended up leaving the Bible college that I was studying at, leaving religion altogether, and trying to sort of figure out my life from scratch. This was sort of in my early 20s, and thing that sort of kept coming back to me as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to actually do with my life was that I'd always wanted to tell stories, to be a writer, right? Be a novelist, and sort of do that whole thing. So I decided to go to university and study creative writing there, with the sort of end goal of being like a high school English teacher, while I focused on writing the first great novel and all that, right? But as I was studying, I started realizing that I was writing a lot about video game narratives. Video games had always been a big part of my life. I grew up in the 90s, so I was a child of the PlayStation 1 and so on. And so I realized that maybe there was something there. So as I came to sort of the end of my undergrad, I started putting out feelers to different people, not actually in the games industry, but industry adjacent. So I was emailing like review websites, people like that, and asking how do you get into the industry? Like, how do I become a writer for games? I really had no idea what I was doing at that point, and neither did these people. Their response was essentially, "Oh, we have no idea, but maybe try talk to this person." So I sort of went down a chain of different people who would be like, "Talk to this person, talk to this person, talk to this person," and eventually I bumped into a guy who was at the time the lead narrative designer of a MMO game, MMORPG called Path of Exile, which is quite a large online fantasy role-playing game that is based here in New Zealand. We sort of hit it off, and he asked me, "Do you want to help me work on this game? We're doing this massive expansion, and it's sort of too much work for me. So I'm looking to bring on like an apprentice, essentially." I agreed, not really knowing what the game was at the time. Once I signed a contract and everything, I discovered that the game at the time had over 10 million registered players. So I kind of went from having no audience to an audience of millions, which was quite staggering and overwhelming at first. But I ended up working with him for a good few months before he decided that he actually wanted to move on to a different project. And so within my first year of working in the industry, I went from having written for nothing to being the lead narrative designer for this massive game. So there was a lot of sort of learning on the spot and figuring out things as I went. But that was sort of my introduction into the industry was being thrown into the deep end of the pool, as it were.
Through hard work, but also through, because I don't want to chuck it all to chance. It's not that I was lucky necessarily. It's just by working hard, I ended up creating opportunities to meet other people. So I met with a game designer, a guy who works at Ubisoft, during a local convention in Montreal. We were both like I think there was both of us and one other person were GMing like open tabletop games. Like, you come in, you sit down, you play, and when you're bored, you get up and you leave. And so during like some of the lulls, we would talk together. And I had seen him before. He had like a blog. That was back when people had blogs, by the way. So I knew him a bit from the internet, but not that much. So we got to talking a bit. And of course, I back then was nowhere near the level of experience that I have now. But the thing is, we kept in touch. We met at other conventions like Gen Con, and PAX. And then one day he posted on his timeline that Flyos were looking for narrative designers. I think so. The first time I met him we were probably in 2015. So I had like almost 5 years, 3 of which were spent also streaming, mostly, five on average 5 nights a week. So I had worked on a lot of projects. My face was a little bit everywhere. and it was easier for the the person that's my boss now to find information about me. I had published adventures. They weren't super popular or whatever, but the thing is these were things that I could show him. Here's how I write, here's what I write, and look, people are willing to pay for it, and that goes a long way. But then I also had to go through writing exams, because it's all fine and dandy. You can write adventures in, let's say, the D&D tone, which is very dry, very technical manual. And then, but does that mean you're going to be able to do dialogue very well? Are you able to convey subtext through a few lines of dialogue? Are you able to write concisely? So sometimes some people will need long-winded sentences just to say one bit of information. Are you able to compress all of this? Are you able, in a way, to get the attention of your reader and keep their attention and make them want to read more by writing something that's no longer than a tweet? That was one of the the tests that I had to pass. In order to be able to succeed and to pass all these tests, I worked my ass off for 4 or 5 years, just in my little corner of the world. I didn't. None of the people that I met at convention afterward, or at networking events or what have you, none of it mattered. And in fact, I could have never met this specific designer, and just had seen his tweet on my timeline. Still, if I just followed him, because I'm, we all follow each other on Twitter, so it could have been just that too. So that's why I said I don't want to say it's pure luck, but at the same time, it is not also 100% just hard work and throwing my CV everywhere in my portfolio until someone picked me. There's a bit of both.
For me, I have been writing. I started my first novel at 12 years old, and I think for a lot of kids, the genesis was the same for a lot of kids, especially kids who write science fiction fantasy. I played a lot of Warhammer and Dungeons and Dragons, and eventually Cyberpunk 2020, and those types of games taught me to love both these wild worlds and these fantastical places and adventures and that kind of thing, but it also taught me to love storytelling. I always loved to be the DM. I loved to put my friends through these types of adventures, and so of course, when your friends go home at the end of the night, but you're not ready to be done, if you have that sort of creative spark, you're going to inherently just start to create your own worlds. So, of course, a lot of it too is just being a nerd. I loved maps. I loved the map at the front of The Lord of the Rings. So I also started, as a young person, just drawing maps and drawing crazy creatures and doing all that. And as I aged, I continued to write my whole life. I majored in creative writing, but then I realized I was a little bit too sensitive to write and have people read my writing. So I took a long break from that and just sort of created for myself. During that time, I worked as a zookeeper, and so eventually, I got kicked by a giraffe enough times that I stopped feeling so weak and started to feel tough enough to think, okay, I'm probably ready to withstand some Amazon reviews. So eventually I decided to get back into writing. The real reason for that was when my son was born, I kind of wanted to show him, even though he was, just a baby, I wanted to show him that you could pursue your dream at any age. So I started writing some fantasy novels. I wrote a fantasy novel, and then during National Novel Writing Month in 2018, I wrote almost the entirety of a second fantasy novel, and I got so burnt out writing fantasy that I decided I needed a break. And the other genre that I really wanted to get into was either, space opera or cyberpunk, because I just love cyberpunk so much. So as a break from Elves and Dwarves, I started to write some cyberpunk, and that was the book that I ended up publishing. I started writing Into Neon just as a break, and then it became this thing that I realized, oh no, this is the story that I really want to tell.
Well, I found out actually while creating the PRGDA that there had been efforts before to create a community years ago, and they weren't well. It didn't go anywhere for whatever reason. So in 2019, I remember that what triggered me at least, was that the ex-governor Ricardo Rosselló, at that time, before like the whole text messages and the WhatsApp thing or Telegram thing like exploded, he had announced that they were going to be focusing on the video game industry, right? Or they're going to be trying to promote the video game industry on the island. And the first thing that I noticed when I saw the people who they were approaching as spokespeople, or there weren't any developers amongst them. Like they were, and don't get me wrong, right? I do think that the people who were part of that, I don't even know what the right word is, like the group or the council, the video game council group. I don't know what it's called, to be honest. They are all, I know them personally. So, and they are all people who are very passionate about the industry and incredibly, they really want Puerto Rico to stand out and for the industry to become what it can be. And I started asking around and poking at people. The irony here is that, I mean, I am technically not a video game developer either, right? I'm a writer. I am a creative for sure, but my day job is certainly not making games. I'm more of an educator and an academic. But I started poking around, asking questions, and then I found the PR game dev community in Discord, and whom a friend had invited me to. And again, I started poking around and asking questions, and I got to meet the amazing people who today help, or more like with the amazing people with whom I collaborate today, and to make the PRGDA possible. But it was at least from my perspective, from my side, it was a reaction to being worried that the industry was not going to be represented by people who actually, make games in Puerto Rico, people who understand how difficult it is, people who know from firsthand experience, like all the hurdles that exist on the island for this space to actually grow. And yeah, that was the catalyst for me. There's certainly, like, probably another, of my colleagues would have a different answer, but at least for me, that's it.
Here are some of their favorite games of all time. A few games to note are Game of Thrones, Power Grid, Numenera, and Lone Wolf. These games are board games, tabletop RPGs, or choose-your-own adventure books, while the rest are video games. Consider checking these games out if you want to learn more about good narrative design and storylines. Warhammer 40k is a miniature tabletop game produced by Games Workshop. Warhammer 40k is also known for having dozens of tabletop game spin-offs, video game spin-offs, novels, and more. Finally, I just want to emphasize one game in particular, which is Nier Automata, developed by Platinum Games. This game uses its themes perfectly with the story and gameplay. Let's summarize what we discussed in a few bullet points. Narrative design is the art and science of creating a story in a game that revolves around player interactivity. A great narrative designer needs good communication, good writing, a good understanding of storytelling, and experience for playing different games. Tabletop games and video games have similar creative processes but have different limitations and challenges. Tabletop games and RPGs are a great entry point in being a narrative designer. Compared to a novelist, a narrative designer must work with different mediums and challenges, such as character animation, dialogue choices, environment design, and so on. Learn from other talented designers in the industry and don't stop learning. And finally, to expand an industry, developers need tools and options to grow. These are the fundamentals of narrative design and how to get started. By no means this presentation covers all its technical aspects and creativities. There's more to learn, and the next step after watching this is to continue learning from other designers and academics from the industry. The following slides show videos, books, and events that you should consider checking out to learn more about narrative design. Brooke Maggs is a narrative designer from Remedy Entertainment, and in this video, she goes into detail on how she worked on each project, from The Gardens Between to Control. Carrie Sherrill is a narrative designer, producer, and marketing director where she provided her services to Riot Games and Humble Games. And in this video, she gives a short presentation on how to go from aspiring to a narrative designer using free or paid tools online. Although this book is not specifically for narrative designers, The Lazy Dungeon Master gives game masters and writers a quick and easy guide on how to organize their ideas on paper. The Player and the Pentacles is a book written by Nick Jones, and in this book, he shares his personal narrative design model developed through PhD research in collaboration with other experts in the field. Finally, the book Video Game Storytelling, written by Evan Skolnick, provides the fundamentals of storytelling in video games and insight in how game development works from a professional's point of view. Finally, GDC, Game Developers Conference, is a popular event among designers, developers, and employees from the industry. They provide lectures on game design, project management, narrative design, and many more topics. Check out the GDC Vault on their website for more information. All the links for these references will be available in the description box below. So before ending this presentation, I would like to reference a quote by Mihaly, a psychologist known for a psychological concept of flow, and he said, "To be successful, you have to enjoy doing your best, while at the same time contributing to something beyond yourself." So yeah, thank you for watching. Make sure to follow our amazing guests on social media and their respective websites. Thanks again to our guests, Colin, Mateusz, Nick, Shirley, Simon, and Matthew for taking time for this project. If anyone watching has any questions regarding to narrative design or anything else mentioned in this presentation, make sure to leave them in the comment section below. And also I want to mention that later this year I'll be publishing the full interviews from some of our guests in this presentation to my YouTube channel, Mr. Stids. Once they do get published, make sure to check them out. And so yeah, thanks again for watching and happy gaming.